Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this session. We're a special edition of our usual virtual meetup, Reimagining Careers Education. And as promised, we've managed to get Patrick O'Reilly, Head of Pathways and Partnerships for Sydney Catholic Schools, to join us. He's recently been on the panel of the review of senior secondaries pathways into further education, work and training. And the report was released last week with some big recommendations. So thank you for joining us, Pat. We've also got Professor Jim Bright here, as always, and we've got some questions from the audience. But before we start, Pat, can you give us a little bit of context around this report and the review itself? Early in the document, it says it was part of one of 13 related reviews. So where does this fit in, and kind of what was its purpose?
The National Reform Agreement that the states and territories signed off on in 2013 had 8 national priority initiatives, and this is one of those. And a significant part of the brief in our terms of reference was further shaped by the Gonski review from 2018. Interestingly, of the 13 related reviews, which are a mixture of past, present and ongoing, some are state, some are national, some are very specific to particular groups of people, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for example. And I think interestingly and timely that the announcement today of the 16 new targets beyond the closing the gap, and a number of those obviously addressing education in its various forms and formats. I think the other thing just to note at the outset too, yes, as you've said in beginning the conversation, Liv, it's a review of senior secondary education pathways to work, further education and training. That's I guess the subtitle of the report. But the other thing that was there in the initial brief was some words which added, and consideration of prerequisites for university entry. And that's sort of not necessarily in the title as such, but that was part of what came our way.
Okay, great. And how long has the process been? How has it been?
So it was 12 months. So we kicked off in July last year, through to presentation to the minister in the last few weeks. As people will have read in the data, there were 200 or more submissions. We spoke to 700 different people. The consultations and forums. I was very happy to know and note that the young people themselves were critical to the people that we spoke to, and in fact the very last one that we managed just before the pandemic kicked in on March 10th in Wagga was the young people themselves. So yeah, just on 12 months.
So they were the community forums in every state?
Yeah, so we spoke to young people, we spoke to community forums that constituted educators, business and industry, tertiary providers, and each of us as panel members grazed far and wide. So, there were the big cities, there were regional and rural. We really wanted to get, that broad and deep representation of people and voices across the country.
Cool. And was that separate to the FYA research with young people specifically?
Yes, it was. It was.
So it was
the FYA did play a role. If memory serves it correctly, they were instrumental in bringing together some of the young people at the forum in Victoria. But yeah, their research is separate too.
Okay. Perfect. And so if you could clarify, how would you express the purpose and remit? Was there anything out of bounds?
Yeah, it was very clear at the outset that we were not looking at curriculum. That obviously is a state and territory remit, so we weren't to go there. And in amongst the various related reviews that were noted in the report, being in New South Wales, we are well aware of that piece of work that's going on, but equally there's pieces of work going on currently in Tasmania, in Victoria, in Queensland, in South Australia. So that was a no-go area. Having said that, we did at least try to think through, well, if we can't deal with state and territory curricula, is there scope, for example, with the national curriculum for us to be looking at that and seeing how that might inform our work or play a role in our work. In noting that, people are well aware that the national curriculum is K to 10 and our focus was more senior. So, you know, how was it that we could consider the national curriculum, knowing that we sort of have these two senior years which sit there and are entirely at the state and territory level. The other area, I guess, really was the ATAR itself. Again, that individual states and territories have got particular positions on the ATAR. I think most people will be aware that, you know, Queensland are only just coming into that themselves in recent times. And as again, we're well aware, the ATAR is largely something which is determined and decided, or at least brokered, I guess, between the state and territory curriculum authorities and UAC or equivalent. So that's something that we weren't in a position to necessarily be, in terms of reference at least, be giving attention to. Having said that, it was virtually impossible not to be speaking to or offering some reflections in relation to that.
Yeah, great. Well, let's use that as the jumping off point, because I think in the report... Oh, sorry, Jim, go on.
Before we go down the rabbit hole of ATAR, Patrick, could I just ask you to clarify something for me around about the relationship between the report and the curriculum? And you say you want to go there, and I can understand why they will be minefields and there's lots of work going on and so forth, and there's state and territory complexities. But I'm just a bit confused that actually the first point of purpose in the report is identifying from existing curriculum frameworks. So I suppose a bit like what you said about the ATAR, it's impossible not really to do your work without a consideration of the curriculum. Did you mean that you weren't to make any recommendations about the curriculum content rather than simply not consider it? Because that is the first point of your purpose.
Sure, Jim. Look, I think if I could use one of the case studies or examples from the actual final report, and I think when I joined this group some weeks ago, I referred to this. I think the work that's going on in South Australia and the SACE board is a really good example of this interface, if you like, where with the SACE and the learner profile that they're looking to have in place for South Australia, and given the Northern Territory also use SACE for the Territory as well, that this learner profile would be something which will capture subjects, courses, grades, marks, which is, you know, what the ATAR is largely derived from currently, but offers something much more in terms of underpinning skills, capabilities, and transferable skills. So for me, I think the question around the ATAR and curriculum is really not getting caught up in debate and discussion around the ATAR as such, but more to look at the question about, so what are the the prerequisites for university entry? What are the prerequisites for leaving school and successfully making that transition into or onto work or education in whatever form it is?
And drawing from existing curriculum frameworks, presumably.
Yes, and again, that, and I'll use the New South Wales example. you know, we're now clearer in New South Wales as to what the recommendations were from the review that Jeff Masters oversaw, and what that's going to begin to look like as it's phased in over the next 4 years.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, let's dive into that ATAR question and get it out of the way, because I think, you know, I think someone made a comment the other day on LinkedIn that the discussion since the report has been published has been disproportionately focused on ATAR, and that actually that reflects the whole system, that everybody is disproportionately obsessed with ATAR given the actual role and importance of it. How did you find that? How was it the most passionate part?
Look, I think, Liv, those very words are the ones that Peter Shergold was quoted in the press recently. Peter and David Gonski were interviewed as part of the University of New South Wales Centre for Social Impact in a webinar, I believe it was early July, looking at the future of education. So I think the critical thing in relation to the question of the ATAR is not necessarily the ATAR as such, but the way in which the ATAR disproportionately affects the way in which education takes place in a 7 to 12 context, and arguably to a lesser extent in a K to 12 context. The extent to which decisions around resources, decisions around timetables, the way in which schools formally and informally, they resource things with that end in mind. That's where this disproportionality impacts in a way that is unhelpful at best, if not a whole lot worse for the 50+% of young people that aren't going to get a university straight out of school and may well make life choices that university is not something that they wish to pursue. Yeah.
And the whole focus has been on all of that weighting has been on the ATAR. And I love the recommendation that, you know, it's about the whole person, it's about the learner profile. I think that would be fantastic. But in reality, if, you know, we know how that the ATAR is not the be all and end all now in reality and for university admissions, yet still it's this massive source of pressure and focus for school. So even if we have the learner profile, if we still have the ATAR, how do we shift that? This is the be all and end all. How do we shift it? What are the dependencies?
Look, none of us can predict, Liv, what the aftermath of the pandemic are going to be. But Peter and we as a panel were very clear that we didn't want to produce this report without referencing that. And there's a significant, you know, afterword, a couple of pages there that there was quite a bit of reflection and crafting of what went into that. I think, you know, there's been lots of debate, discussion about, you know, don't you lose the opportunity that a good crisis provides for us. We're well aware that in New South Wales there are 3 universities, ACU, where Jim is from being one of them, that are looking at entry into the universities based on Year 11 results for next year. University of Western Australia has done so. I believe ANU have it as well. So I think a couple of things. Number one, that to the extent that school and education plays a role in a pathway into university, that universities need to look at what is it that they want as prerequisites for university entry. As recently as last week, the McKell Institute, Sam Crosby, produced a piece which was in the AFR suggesting that ATAR should be capped at 95 and that universities then should be looking at personal skills as the basis upon which they take young people into university. The fact is, we're well aware that 25-26% of people who commenced undergraduate study in New South Wales last year used their ATAR to get there. That 3/4 of them are finding other ways into that.
So is it just a case of the media and PR and education around parents and getting that into schools that it's not the be-all and end-all? I mean, do teachers know that? How is there so much pressure on teachers and within the school? I mean, I'd love to hear from everyone here. What's driving that? When the careers advisor, I've spoken to lots of people who are absolutely transparent that ATAR is not it. There's only 25%, as you say. And there's lots of other ways in and lots of other pathways, but it's not getting through to changing that focus within schools. So, ideas, there's a comment there actually about the PR of it, and attitude is the problem, not the actual ATAR itself, which I think is a really good point. There's a question here, did the panel look at expanding what went into the ATAR, like Year 11 results as well?
Look, the short answer is no, again, for the reasons that I've touched on, that it wasn't part of our remit to look at the ATAR.
Grow it beyond it, so the ATAR is a smaller piece of the puzzle. Yeah. Yeah,
and again, the learner profile is really a richer and deeper way of capturing what a young person leaves school with after 13 years, and that you would hope that if that's embraced and done in a meaningful and genuine way, then that's going to more holistically profiles what a young person's successes and achievements are, and can then speak to an employer, a TAFE director, a university admissions person. It should have a currency that can speak to any and all of those. I was quite taken in some of the conversations that, and again, remembering the various contexts in which I was in one youth forum where a careers person said to me, "Oh, look, the problem here. The problem here is getting students to have aspirations to go past year 10. So as much as for us in our conversations in the big cities, there is there's a dominance, if you like, around the ATAR. That's not the universal narrative. I think equally of, having referenced those targets for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that we're hoping collectively to focus on. What's the value of a young man in a remote community going onto country and having that knowledge? How does that appear in learning? How does that appear in success? How does that get captured in his life experience, and how that can then inform and intersect with an education and training system,
and open up pathways and possibilities that match him uniquely. Yeah, I agree. And I think someone's just put in the comments there, obviously, that it's how schools measure themselves at the moment. It's like an easy measurement, and it's because it's what we can see. And I think the unique student identifier and the big data, being able to go, okay, it's not how many of our students got a ATAR and went to uni, but it will be how many progressed and then went on. We'll have the measure of the lifelong learning can replace that quick shortcut to, is this school good for parents? Because at the end of the day, that's what's driving it, isn't it? So
yeah, and again, people may have heard me say this before, but in both Victoria and Queensland, the state governments there produce a piece of work called On Track. On Track's the Victorian version, and there's a similar version in Queensland where Year 12 students 6 months out of school, they chase them up to find out where they are, and that information goes back to the schools. What would it be like if each school on the My Schools website had that information published rather than NAPLAN data?
Absolutely.
Wouldn't that cut both ways? Couldn't that possibly reinforce issues to do with socioeconomic inequality?
It could, Jim. However, the extent to which, we start to talk about accountability and, what is it that we're working on and for in relation to students and where they land post-school.
And I think that's a good point, but I think, you know, there's always been this debate, hasn't there, about do you measure a school's impact by the value that it adds, or do you measure it by some absolute standard? So in other words, do you measure it by the number of students that get into a group of 8 university, an absolute standard, or do you measure it by the fact that you take in 70% of kids who can't read, and by the end of it, they are highly literate? You know, and there's an argument that in fact it's about adding value. So if you take a bunch of kids from some leafy suburb, it's hardly surprising that they are going to be disproportionately off to university afterwards. Perhaps those schools would actually be adding value by stopping that and allowing those kids to pursue other avenues rather than simply going off and following in the footsteps of their parents, for instance, just as a provocation.
No, I agree. And one of the case studies that is included in the review is St Patrick's Technical College in Elizabeth in the north of Adelaide. You know, one of the, I think it's the second lowest socioeconomic, socio-demographic area in Australia. And after 10 years, the school's now gone past 1,000 apprenticeships in the 10 years that it's operated. But they did an interesting piece of work where they looked at not only the graduate profile, but they attempted to measure the value of the school in relation to the socioeconomic, socio-demographic employment outcomes in that Elizabeth area. And I thought it was a really interesting exercise to, in that case, if you like, look at not only what their Year 12s left with, but the number of apprenticeships and the number of, you know, economic and multiplier effects, for want of a better term, that school, if you like, had created in its 10 or so years.
So using an index rather than a finite stories, yeah, that's smart.
Yes.
Not to get completely overwhelmed by ATAR again, as the temptation is. When we had a quick poll last week, one of the big contentious things when we read the exec summary that we pulled out just as a provocation last week, obviously Jim did to be provocative,
Obviously.
that the availability of high quality career guidance is the single biggest issue, and it's poor quality. Now we asked this audience and more, do you agree with that? Half expecting a bit of, you know, no, and everybody, I think, said, yes, we agree. And I think this group was started because we could see those pockets of best practice and brilliance that you mentioned in the report. But it was so hard to make that consistent and share the best practice and scale it. So absolutely everyone, based on their own networks and challenges, agreed that career guidance in school and career advice at school is lower than what we'd like. But can you talk us through some of the findings? Let's hear, like, what were they saying?
Yeah, look, again, I think to an extent the report, you know, speaks for itself, to state the obvious. There are, as you've said, as people have concurred with last week, there are some outstanding examples of, you know, career guidance, career advice, career counselling, career support in pockets in individual schools. There's a lack of consistency when it comes to expectation in relation to K to 12 in careers, let alone 7 to 12 in careers. And, you know, I would reflect on my own experience in Catholic education, amongst others, to say there is a lack of consistency. There is no mandation around the resourcing of that, to the qualification and professional learning, professional development in relation to those things. So I wonder at some level whether the question about a mandation of a standard with appropriate resources to go with the offering of that service within and across schools. I remember when I last joined this group, you know, there was discussion around Scotland as an example, and how, you know, I think Jim used the term, you know, it's the gold standard almost, that they've taken a much broader view than education I'm not suggesting that the National Careers Institute are going to head down the Scottish path, but the National Careers Institute is well placed to look at careers not only from a school perspective, but from a whole of life perspective. And again, I'm not clear on what route that they're likely to take, but I'd like to think that their brief, their resources, the services that a group like the National Career Institute will in time and turn provide, we'll be able to do that well for school and post-school.
So having that resource, what about, what's it going to mean for careers advisors? So it becomes very optional for schools whether to have that careers advisor or not. I was surprised to see that there was no option for, okay, we're going to increase the resources in, we love we want it to be higher standard, more recognition, what was the wording? Higher status, strengthened and accorded higher status. But doesn't, by making it optional for schools to have a careers advisor, actually erode that?
I think potentially yes. I again don't know from a decision-making point of view, short of, and I'll use this example, which I have on other occasions. Some years ago there was a clear undertaking on the part of the federal government that having funding for and the provision of chaplaincy in schools was a desirable thing, and so the federal government went ahead and funded that. Now, if there was a similar belief on the part of the education minister or the current government that at a federal level at least, this National Careers Institute or the provision of careers work in schools, careers education in schools, is of such importance that the federal government would allocate resources for every school to that effect. I think that would be roundly welcomed. But it's the decision makers, the policy makers at state and federal level. I think ultimately they're the ones that have got the ability to make the decisions, and likewise then the purse strings to open up to fund it.
Patrick, can I pick you up on that point? That's all very well, but why haven't you said that in the report? Why isn't that absolutely spelled out? Because it's clear in the report. You actually speak, the report speaks, not you personally, the report speaks to actually teachers, specific teachers, not the system. Teachers have limited career education knowledge. Some very sweeping statements about the quality of teachers. So why isn't there a recommendation there for greater support for them? I think it's great that you've talked about minimum qualifications for them. I think that's excellent, and the training that they should have. But I found nothing in there about ongoing support, greater resourcing for the existing people, ongoing professional development. The recommendations are all about things sort of outside of the school, National Careers Institute, careers hubs, outsourcing in effect. And it goes back to Liv's point that many principals might say, okay, well, if we're going to have all of these rich sets of resources outside of the school, then we can do away. And in some cases, as you're probably aware, the careers advisor's position is sort of perilous. It's sort of 0.4, or in some cases 0.2, token sorts of gestures at best already. And this could serve to undermine it. I think it was clearly in the scope of the report, but given the remarks that have been made, for instance, about ATAR, and very strong remarks in the report urging change. There was an opportunity there, wasn't there, to urge change in relation to the support and funding of careers advisors?
Yeah, look, I take your point, Jim, and I don't disagree with the angle that you're taking. I suppose to an extent, I'm conscious that, you know, the review was a national one. The review was attempting to address circumstances from the big cities to, you know, the most rural and remote. I think there's an extent to which, you know, particularly in relation to the National Careers Institute, that whatever we would want for a young person in Unadata would be the same as what we would want for, you know, a young person in the centre of Sydney. The extent to which then is that going to be best delivered or met by saying we want specifically resources for careers people in every school, or do we think or believe that greater consistency in the service of every young person can be better done through the National Careers Institute? And I'm not clear on that, but I do think that there was an extent to which that national agenda and the various groups that the report was trying to come up with the best recommendations to accommodate the needs of.
Yeah, I can see that it would, that there's a big gap, and it's hard in some of the rural and remote areas. It's hard to provide that baseline consistency of information and advice. One of the examples is we've talked about in this session, the Singaporean model. I don't know whether Jeffrey's there, where they have highly qualified, but and do that, raise the status and the prominence with the principals and the educators, raise the status of these experts, but it's a shared resource, which might be the career hubs, but it sounds much more like the career hubs are a source of information. Somebody on the comments has just said, in terms of another website, more resources and more information provision. Whereas actually I think the role of careers advisors in school is much more guidance and trust and that relationship to steer that whole person. And I guess my other concern is that if everything gets outsourced in terms of career expert, we want teachers generally to be, you know, if we look at that continuum of learning around careers education, and we say, you know, we want everyone to leave with the skills to manage this lifetime of learning, then that has to be on the curriculum. I'd love to see it as the fourth essential skill and pulled out separate to the general capabilities, because, you know, if we're talking about lifelong learning, there's separate skills to creativity and communication. But if we're expecting all teachers to be able to deliver that from primary up, then at least there should be professional learning provision for that, or something in there that allows that to be delivered within schools. I think it's a shame that the careers advice wasn't, it seems like a bit of a done deal when you read the report that this is the solution, rather than, and I wonder whether the panel reviewed, you know, what would happen if we actually tackled this big challenge of the principals don't prioritize it or don't see the value in it. What if we tackled that and proved the value with evidence, rather than just say, actually, let's outsource it? Was there any evidence around that?
Again, we heard from and spoke to some great examples where, you know, we could see that people on the ground in schools were doing a great job. But it's that lack of consistency between public and state education and non-government education, a lack of consistency from rural and remote to city. You know, it's the consistency question and the.
Patrick, in terms of that consistency thing, and looking at the composition of the panel, I was struck by the fact that there was nobody with a careers advice, career education background on that panel, yet the panel saw fit to make some very, very strong statements about this, and on the basis of evidence which hasn't been published, which hasn't been reviewed, We don't know who these students are you spoke to. We don't know how many careers advisors, from where, from what schools. There's none of that information is in the report, yet there are the recommendations claiming that it's inadequate nationally. And I take your point about rural and remote, and I can see a bit of a theme here, but what concerns me is when you've got what percentage of the Australian population, school population in urban centres, I don't know what the numbers would be, but if we said 70%, there would be a conservative estimate, I'm sure. Is there a risk here that we are trying to produce a uniform approach which is actually tailored to the minority and not to the majority? And if there are these inconsistencies and disparities, is it actually misguided to look for a singular approach to this? And in fact, we might need blended and different approaches. So that's one concern. Another one is throughout the report, and I've seen many of these reports over the last 25 years, too readily, there seems to be people equating career decisions with information, that the way to make good career decisions is simply to provide better information. This completely discounts the role of counselling, career guidance. It completely discounts the psychological and sociological issues and the circumstances in which people find themselves. It discounts people's levels of self-efficacy. You do not make good career decisions simply because you are well informed. But of course, provision of information has never been cheaper. Bung it on a website. Of course, we had one called My Future, that's gone. Are these proposals simply going to be My Future version 2?
To your first observation, Jim, 3 points or thoughts. One, in terms of the constitution of the panel, that was very much directed by the state and territory ministers in terms of education, in terms of reference. So that's where, for each of us that were invited to participate, that was done at that level of Education Council. Second thought, I think ultimately, in attempting to undertake the task that we had, each of the states and territories, and then each of the regions within the states and territories will take the review recommendations and make of them what they will. And hopefully, as you rightly observe, done entirely contextually appropriately. Within a school district, within an individual school, and to do that in a way that makes sense for that group of young people and that particular community. Third point, I again take the point in relation to information, and that's that's a part of it, but it is the individual work of the careers advisors and the teachers and staff who know the young people best, in providing that advice, that encouragement, being able to affirm the gifts and talents that the young people have from what they can demonstrate, and hopefully with that broader learner profile have other ways and means by which that can be captured. That they get the counselling, they get the advice to take that first positive, successful step out of school, and gets them on the way in a lifelong sense.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think I'll step back, but having heard that affirmation, and I'm pleased to hear it. I suppose it's disappointing, therefore, if that's acknowledged. It wasn't acknowledged in the report. There seems to be some lack of balance in relation to that. And if that was seen as important, why wasn't it in the report? And following from that, why, therefore, were there not recommendations to enhance that level of support amongst those people who know the students best? Because it looks like a model of bringing in people who do not know the students. And that seems to be a bit contrary to what you've just said. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying you can't reconcile those. I'm not saying there's not a role, but it just, again, there seems to be a theme of not doing anything with the existing systems to enhance them, but rather add stuff on outside.
Yeah, look, if there's a level of ambiguity about that, Jim, I apologise. I see, again, the National Careers Institute being very much playing a coordination and overseeing role. They're not coming into or onto, you know, the level of the school and the work that's done by people in that context, in the school context. The other thing, I think, which I want to particularly note are those last two pieces, or last two case studies in the report. One, the data from the New South Wales government for over 20 years of 16 to 24-year-olds, and another piece of work that's being done across Commonwealth departments, the JEDI project, where there's really rich data and information in relation to labour market, in relation to pathways, in relation to experience, particularly in New South Wales over 20 years, that ideally you know, can find its way into all sorts of different people's careers advice, to policy, to the way in which education and post-school education systems operate. I'm not sure that those data sources necessarily get to where they need to when it comes to, you know, the work of people in schools and other policy makers. Hopefully from those sources, better decisions and better resourcing can be made and done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think the information provision at that level will be really useful, but probably only if there is PL, if there is, you know, if trainee teachers, as someone said, are trained in careers education and how to source up-to-date market information. And we, you know, when we talk to teachers about a whole school approach and empowering that whole school approach to careers education from the earlier years, a lot of it is lack of confidence. And as you said, you know, teachers have limited knowledge of the world of work. So if we can get that data and dynamically update it and enforce it through professional learning and ongoing professional learning, and recognise careers as a key part of a teacher's role, that would be fantastic. I mean, okay, so hopefully we'll see it augment and complement the existing resource and raise the profile. I think it will be potentially, you know, hopefully that's the NCI framework, and the career hubs will strengthen that, and I think they have done in Scotland, but I think it's been coupled there with tackling this brand problem of status of careers and making sure that principals and policymakers understand how powerful it can be. So and we've kind of touched on this next area that we wanted to cover, which is about decisions or skills. Now, I was like jumping for joy when I saw, hey, it's from primary, it's about teaching them the skills, not about making decisions. And I guess because the focus of the report was slightly later, maybe that's why it doesn't go into any detail. How do you imagine that happening? How does it go from here if it wasn't one of the key recommendations? Well, it kind of was a key recommendation, but that it doesn't make it through to implementation.
Can you just elaborate a little further on that, Liz?
So when you've got the map of the learning framework, and the fourth essential skill being, you know, work exploration and pathways and being able to make great decisions, we're really talking about the proper careers education, not just the awareness piece,
yes,
but decision making, how to filter influences, how to move beyond your pathway from an early age when we know it's critical. But how do you imagine that coming into effect? Is that at state level through curriculums, or if we leave it, we know that if we leave it there as a, you know, the evidence has been there for 30 years that we should start in primary. Is this going to change it?
Again, it has to come down to, I believe, the individual states and territories and the position that they take. I think there is an opportunity there with the general capabilities, and particularly given that the general capabilities have recently been, or there's been a recent announcement, I should say, the general capabilities are going to be reviewed. If there was some way of bringing it into the general capabilities with more mandation and accountability, maybe that's a way into what you're suggesting. I think particularly if there was an approach taken with the general capabilities where children and young people were creating and adding to a portfolio which is within that learner profile, and within that portfolio there are particular tasks, if you like, or expectations that young people have in relation to work and careers education and work exploration as part of a progression through to year 10. I think there's scope there for what you're talking about, Liv.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd love to have it just an extra one, and because I think a lot of the times the people expect this skill for lifelong learning to just be absorbed organically if they're good communicators, rather than explicit careers education skills. But I'll rant on about that for hours.
I'll just hit you at the other end of the scale, Patrick, as well. We've talked about the kindergarten. Adults, and I suppose the COVID thing has really brought home the value of ongoing, real, true, lifelong career guidance systems. Us in the industry have always known this, of course. But again, it doesn't matter what framework you look at, whether you look at the Australian Blueprint for Career Development, which incidentally, I wasn't sure if I saw it that reference once, but it talks about sort of lots of stages up until about the age of 20, and then after that you're an adult and there's one. And of course that's a very traditional kind of almost 1950s idea that by about the age of 21 you're Dustin Hoffman, you're the graduate, you've decided what to do with your life, and then you just go off and live it. And of course Dustin in that movie didn't. So we've known for an awful long time that adults have changed careers and have all kinds of unexpected setbacks and opportunities come their way and the rest of it. I think there's a structural issue here, isn't there? That we've got departments of education dealing often with the issue of educating younger people, typically, but also adults. And then you've got usually departments of employment who get very worried about people losing their jobs. And there's a fault line in the whole of this transition field, if you will, because it goes across these two government agencies, and there have been attempts historically to put them into one, and then they become unwieldy and then they get taken apart again. But I do think that adults still are not particularly well served, and they either have to go to private practitioners if they can afford to do so. So there's a social justice issue in there as well. Or they have to be absolutely in the last chance saloon before they get access to some very limited careers advice. I think maybe that's beyond your scope, but I think that's something that needs addressing.
Yeah, look, I do think to an extent, Jim, it was beyond our scope. However, we did, I think it's the first diagram or the first figure around about page 17 in the report, where we do map out pathways, from primary, early, secondary. Then we had a grouping of 9, 10, 11 and 12. Then we move into a post-school transition, year 13. We then talked about a 19 to 25-year-old pathway, progression and transition, and later career stages. So there was some effort on our part to sort of set it up in that lifelong sense. I do absolutely agree with you, though, that as much as this report's gone to Dan Tehan as the Education Minister, equally Michaelia Cash has come out and made some positive statements in relation to recommendations in the report. So clearly in her role in relation to industry and small business, we absolutely need alignment and coherence between various ministers and various departments if these things are going to come to fruition in a positive way. And I couldn't agree more. Post the pandemic, what transition is going to look like for the current year 12s, let alone those that follow. Some enormous challenges there.
Yeah, I think that 19 to 25-year-old support will have so much impact. It's the amount of change and the amount of young people stuck in that transition time is it's fantastic to see that. I'm opening it up to questions, but while you're writing your questions or sticking your hand up, we haven't got much time left, but I just wanted to quickly touch on the challenge of all pathways being equally respected. and whether principals raised any challenges to this, and how do they make that happen, because it's such a shift from where they are now for a lot of schools.
Liv, if I could, I suppose, reflect more on my experience of 10 years of principalship of a vocational college, more so than as a member of the panel. Each year, Year 12 would get to the point of graduation and we would celebrate their successes and achievements. As we're well aware in New South Wales, the number of column inches that are devoted to HSC results, league tables, and to subsequently university offers, I think that's a fairly clear reflection, both practically and symbolically, about measures of success, and by extension then that vet and vocational education lacks a parity of esteem. That is an observation that's made in the report. It remains a challenge. We equally heard in the panel process of increasing numbers of people who commence a university degree or complete a university degree, then undertake vocational education and training qualification, and that becomes the enabler for employment for them. So the final observation I'd make is one that we heard at the panel. Jennifer Westcott and Peter Shergold, two of the panellists, are involved in the Aerotropolis project in Western Sydney, and for the workforce there, they've already decided that the blend, if you like, of skills and training that workers at the Aerotropolis are going to require will be a mixture of university and TAFE, vet, and on-the-job training. And so it's very much a bespoke approach to skilling and training. And I think that's a far healthier and a far more realistic way to be considering preparation for and ongoing professional learning and training than to be looking at individual silos as we've tended to operate and continue to. That
sounds like a really innovative approach. That's great. Mandy has asked, has principals been sent this report other than by us? I mean, it's out there in the public domain. Of the education ministers, do you know of any of the education ministers at the state level have done anything specific on that?
I'm not aware. I did read comments from the Education Minister in Western Australia that were very positive, and in particular saying that a number of the recommendations in the report that she felt that the WACE and the Western Australian education system were already doing. But yeah, I'm unaware as to whether the report has been disseminated widely.
I mean, everybody should be engaging with this. It's such an important piece of work. This is Mandy's question. What hope do we have to achieve equity and outcomes for students when governments readily decide that some career pathways have no value and should be more expensive than the ones that appear to fill the economic holes? Okay, so this is back to our very heated debate a couple of weeks ago around the change to the university fees and being so demand-led and skewing people away. I'm not sure it's fair to put that one on Patrick right now.
I won't tackle that, but will say that I've been impressed by TAFE New South Wales during the pandemic. I think initially they offered something like 15 free short courses, and they did, and then added another 9 subsequently. There's a level of, I suppose, responsiveness and offer on the part of TAFE in the pandemic, and I believe post the pandemic to look at, and one that I'm aware of is cybersecurity as an area where there's huge demand and huge opportunity, and the universities are likewise in that space. To use cybersecurity as an example, I would hope that there can be more affordable ways, including some of these free course offerings, to sort of kickstart young people into career pathways where there are legitimate skill shortages and longer term employment opportunities.
I hope that kind of answers your question, Mandy. I think it kind of. So in terms of what's next, if you had the magic wand, what do you hope would happen next off this report?
I think just to take the careers advice education question first, that absolutely it becomes a more consistently addressed area, K-12, that it is aligned with a learner profile, that it is situated somewhere where it will be taken seriously and addressed seriously, and I think the general capabilities is a way into that. I think that in a broader sense, we need a new social settlement around post-school pathways. It seems to me that from a macro resourcing perspective, we're good in terms of primary and secondary education. We're pretty good in terms of university education. TAFE and VET is the poor second child. And unless and until there's a complete rethink, and again, there's a review of that going on in New South Wales currently that David Gonski and Peter Sheargold are looking at, then I'm not sure that the challenges that are there around the valuing of pathways and the perceptions in relation to those pathways. If I was the emperor, I'd be looking towards Switzerland as an example of best practice in terms of their schooling system and their post-school system. The way in which business and industry understand that there's a social contract or a social compact, if you like, in working with the next generation, that it's not something that is, revolves around or is reliant upon subsidies in order to try and attract employers to be in that space, or to have universities and training providers needing to be incentivized to do that.
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? Move from a system of inputs and outputs where the school system is responsible for delivering a product that the industry will pick up. It's actually their responsibility as well. So much more efficient, as well as the only way we'll make it, I think. Any other concluding comments, Jim? I
was just choking on your producing, the schools produce a product. It's as bad as human capital in organisations. We're dealing with people; they're not products.
It's seen as inputs and outputs, though, isn't it? In the old way. Yes,
I know. I'm just being, my tongue is firmly in my cheek when I say that. I think I want to thank you, Patrick, for your work and for coming along and helping us to understand this better. I think anything that starts raises awareness and starts a national debate about career education is a good thing, and it's good that there's an agenda there. And I think it's clear from your comments that if this report is read imaginatively, and if it's implemented imaginatively, it's got the potential to do some very good things. As always, the devil's in the detail, and it will be how the states and even as you say, individual schools and communities pick it up. I think that is obviously, that's a conversation and a debate for the future. And I think and I like your last point about Switzerland and business. We've got to find a way of getting industry and the educational sector working together and recognizing mutual responsibilities. It's funny, maybe I'm just getting old in the tooth, but I heard somebody talking about sort of the notion of national duty. And maybe it's an old fuddy-duddy kind of concept, but maybe we need to start, all of us, thinking beyond our own individual requirements and needs to more of what we can do for society.
Thank you. I think we did have a conversation. There's an initiative happening in WA, and someone had suggested it was COVID was the perfect time to bring back national service in some form. And a bit, you know, that active citizenship is a really key component of all. So thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us to take a grilling. It was really useful to be able to ask you what was going on under the hood of the review. We will put this recording up tomorrow for those that missed it, and share broadly. And yes, thank you again.